The irony was so thick, I could taste it in every slow sip of my Ethiopian roast. From the corner office of Virion Labs, I had a perfect view of the San Diego harbor, sunlight dancing off the water like it was celebrating something I already knew. Karma always pays her debts with interest. Synthera Technologies, the billion-dollar biotech giant I once helped build from the dust, was down 53% in stock value in just 3 weeks. Regulatory flags, product recalls, investor panic, all because of one little piece of paper. A patent. My patent. It wasn't a vendetta. It wasn't revenge. It was just unfinished business. They fired me to cut costs. After 15 loyal years, after I'd built the core technology that made them who they were, they tossed me out like surplus lab equipment. They called it a strategic restructuring. I called it what it was, short-sighted greed dressed up in PowerPoint slides. But here's the part they didn't see coming. While they were busy replacing seasoned scientists with MBA-slinging buzzword barons, they forgot to read the fine print. They forgot who actually owned the core of their flagship drug delivery platform. During a chaotic merger years ago, someone in legal forgot to have me sign the assignment. That single clerical oversight meant that while Synthera had the right to use my technology, that right vanished the moment they showed me the door. So I let them do it. I let them fire me. And I waited. Now, they're paying triple just to keep their supply chain afloat, begging for licensing terms I write in my sleep. I didn't plan for revenge. I built a system to save lives. But when you bet against the person who created the foundation of your empire, you'd better be ready to rebuild from rubble. Because sometimes the most powerful asset you discard is the one that owns you. I still remember the smell of that old warehouse where Synthera was born, dust, faint acetone, the rubbery tang of gloves, and something metallic that lingered in the air long after the lights shut off. It wasn't glamorous. The lab benches were salvaged from a closing university. Half the HVAC system ran on hope and aluminum tape. But back in 2008, it was paradise for someone like me, someone with a head full of ideas and nowhere else to put them. I'd left MIT that year with a postdoc under my belt and a research folder full of promise, but not much else. I gotten a few offers from pharma behemoths back east. Fat salaries, fancy titles, but no room to truly build. They wanted technicians. I was an inventor. What I had was untested, unpolished, and a little wild. But it had teeth. I knew that if we could teach nanoparticles to mimic the body's own transport systems, if we could cloak therapy inside biology, we might finally crack the blood-brain barrier. Diseases like Alzheimer's, Parkinson's, even glioblastomas, they all had the same villain in common. An immune system that meant well, but blocked every good thing trying to get in. Synthera didn't have deep pockets, but it had vision. Richard Boyd, the founding CEO, was grizzled, ex-Army biotech, the kind of guy who'd worked in the shadows of DARPA for too long and had come out with a righteous fire to do something good before he died. He believed in big swings, as he called them. If you're not trying to change the game, you shouldn't be on the field, he told me over tacos during my final interview. We're not building aspirin here. We're building revolutions. I signed a contract that night. A modest salary, a generous chunk of equity, and a blank canvas. My office was a supply closet they cleared out for me, and I slept there more often than not. Brought in a cot, kept my ties in a filing drawer, lived on vending machine peanuts and caffeine from a half-broken espresso knockoff. The early months were brutal. My first prototypes failed spectacularly. The nanoparticles either collapsed in plasma or got flagged by macrophages before they even reached capillaries. For every model that survived simulation, 3 more fizzled in live tissue. But failure never scared me. What scared me was not knowing why. And so, I chased every anomaly, mapped every unexpected spike, read immune responses like ancient poetry, trying to decode the line between hostile and harmless. The nights were the worst and the best. That's when the building quieted down, and the hum of equipment became my only company. I'd stare into microscope images until my eyes crossed, looking for patterns nobody else could see. And then one night, it happened. The realization that cracked everything wide open. 2 failed runs, identical in setup but run on different carriers, had nearly opposite results. One was instantly neutralized, the other slipped through longer. Not success, but a pause. A hesitation. That hesitation was gold. It told me we were triggering something, and that meant we could control it. The immune system wasn't blocking us because we were weak. It was blocking us because we looked too foreign, too aggressive. That was the problem. We weren't trying to fool the gatekeeper. We were barging in wearing masks and wondering why we got shot on sight. I grabbed a notebook, still have it, covered in coffee stains and scrawls, and sketched out a new delivery method, biomimetic nanoparticles. Instead of synthetic shells, we'd build our carriers from lipid layers, mimicking astrocyte transport vesicles. We'd hide therapy behind familiarity, make the body believe it was welcoming its own creation. That sketch became a prototype. That prototype became dozens more. And eventually, it became something bigger. A system that worked not only in tissue samples, but in preclinical models. It was the seed of everything that followed. And when we filed for the patent, I didn't think twice about the assignment paperwork. Nobody did. It was a crazy time. Synthera was in the middle of acquiring a failing biotech out of Denver, and the legal team was buried in IP merges and compliance filings. I signed what they sent me, but for that one particular patent, US 9XXXXXB1, somehow they never sent the final assignment form. So it sat there, filed with me as the inventor and the owner. Synthera had an exclusive license, but one with a clear expiration clause, my employment. I had no intention of using it as leverage. Not then. Not for years. But sometimes, the most powerful moves begin as afterthoughts. It's funny how something so critical, a single unchecked box, a missing signature, can sit quietly for years, unnoticed, like a dormant fault line beneath a city. No alarms. No tremors. Just silence until one day the ground splits open. That's exactly what happened with patent US 9762853B1. We had just emerged from 2 brutal years of development. Failed trials, funding threats, even a short-lived investor mutiny when our runway hit double-digit days. But the breakthrough came, not all at once, but piece by piece, like assembling a miracle in slow motion. Our first successful delivery across the blood-brain barrier in a human model changed everything. It wasn't just data on a spreadsheet. It was a shift in what's possible. And I remember thinking, this will outlive me. We filed the patent immediately. I remember the night we submitted the paperwork, a modest celebration with cheap bourbon and burnt pizza. I didn't check every form. Why would I? We had a legal department. I was deep in formulation data and regulatory prep. The company was closing its acquisition of Dynaform Biologics at the time, a sloppy, frantic merger to swallow their pain therapeutics pipeline before it got bought up by Genexa. The lawyers were overwhelmed, filing patents, integrating teams, managing 2 entire IP portfolios and compensation contracts. In that chaos, the paperwork for my patent, the one that carried the foundation of everything we had just proven, slipped through the cracks. The assignment to Synthera was drafted but never executed. So the record stood exactly as it had been submitted. I, Nathan Hale, listed as the sole inventor and owner, with Synthera granted an exclusive license. But here's the kicker. That license was conditional, explicitly tied to my employment. A clause tucked into the agreement like an afterthought, valid only for the duration of contributors' active contractual service with Synthera Technologies. Legal boilerplate, sure, but legally binding. I didn't find this out until years later, in 2017. I was cleaning out an old laptop before passing it on to a new lab assistant when I stumbled across a folder labeled Filing under D. Inside was a PDF and signed, and a note from legal saying, please confirm before end of day. I never did. No one followed up. It was like seeing a gun you forgot was loaded, sitting under your bed for a decade. I should have said something. I meant to. I even wrote an email to our general counsel about it, saved it in my drafts. But then we had a flare-up in trial data from our Parkinson's therapy. 2 researchers quit. The budget got slashed by 12% with no warning. And just like that, the oversight became another fire left smoldering in the corner. And frankly, I trusted them. At that point, Synthera felt like home. We weren't just colleagues, we were soldiers. We had gone to war together, spent sleepless nights in the lab, fought over data, celebrated every milestone with the kind of exhausted joy only the truly obsessed understand. I had no reason to think they'd ever weaponize my loyalty against me. I was a cornerstone of the company. Hell, I was the company in some ways. I figured if I ever left, it'd be with a handshake and a plaque, not a pink slip. So I let it sit. I never told Richard Boyd, our original CEO, and I certainly didn't mention it to the next regime when he stepped down. Especially not to Martin Kessler, the polished pharma bro who replaced him, all tailored suits and disruption metrics, with barely a passing grasp on the science that powered our success. I just kept working, leading, innovating, until the tide shifted. The layoffs started subtly. First, a few junior chemists quietly reassigned. Then budget reviews got longer. Access to early trial platforms began requiring strategic approval. And then came Blake Donovan, the fresh-faced CFO from New York who walked into our world like he was auditing a vending machine, not a biomedical miracle. I should have seen the writing on the wall, but I didn't. I was too busy trying to save lives. So when a restructuring plan finally came down and my badge access started vanishing one lab at a time, I didn't panic. I got to work, not in the lab, but on my own terms. I pulled out that old folder again, reviewed every line, consulted an IP attorney under the guise of hypothetical risk modeling. And when he looked up from the agreement, eyes wide with disbelief, I knew. That dormant patent, the one they forgot to steal, was now the detonator I never knew I was holding. And I wasn't planning to bluff. It started with a town hall, one of those all-hands meetings where leadership stands beneath soft lights and delivers bad news dressed up in buzzwords and vague optimism. The kind of performance where they tell you it's not a funeral, it's a strategic realignment. I knew the routine. Hell, I'd written speeches like that for Richard Boyd back in the early days when we had to cut a program to stay alive another month. But this one was different. This one wasn't about keeping Synthera alive. It was about bleeding it for short-term numbers. Martin Kessler stood on stage like a man who had just memorized his lines 5 minutes before stepping into the spotlight. He wore a sleek navy suit with an unnecessary pocket square and the forced enthusiasm of a politician running for office he didn't believe in. I watched from the back of the room, arms crossed, unreadable. The last time Martin had spoken to me directly, it was to compliment my longevity like I was a dog who'd outlived expectations. Synthera is entering a new era, he announced, smiling like he'd just solved world hunger. We're embracing a more agile, market-responsive future. It's about delivering value, not just science. The words hit like blunt instruments. I could almost feel my colleagues around me flinch, some subtly, some not. We all understood what agile meant in this context. Cheaper, faster, dumber. And value was no longer about innovation or impact. It was about shareholder sugar highs and quarterly earnings calls that made hedge fund managers smile for 6 minutes. Then came the introduction. I'm thrilled to welcome Blake Donovan, our new Chief Financial Officer, who will lead our operational optimization strategy. Applause, polite and hollow. Blake stepped onto the stage like he'd just been handed an award. He was young, maybe early 30s, and everything about him screamed curated. The haircut, the glasses, the slim-fit charcoal suit that probably cost more than my entire wardrobe. He looked like a GQ model who had wandered into a Fortune 500 boardroom by mistake. But it wasn't the look that bothered me. It was the tone. Blake's voice had that practice cadence, honed at some Ivy League MBA finishing school, full of phrases that said nothing and confidence that said everything. R&D is essential, but we must ensure it's delivering predictable returns, he said. We're not abandoning innovation. We're redefining it. Redefining it, I thought. That's the line. That's where the knife goes in. From that day on, the mood inside Synthera shifted like a barometer before a storm. Project timelines were reevaluated, budgets were streamlined, and suddenly, every new initiative had to submit a market analysis before it could even request lab time. My team, once the nucleus of everything Synthera stood for, became just another line item for Blake to question, reduce, or erase. Then, quietly, methodically, they began stripping me of access. It started with emails. I stopped receiving invites to strategic planning sessions. Then came security permissions. My badge no longer opened the prototype wing. When I raised the issue, IT said it was a system migration. When I followed up, no one replied. The final blow came not in an email or a meeting, but in a hallway. I walked into the lab one morning to find Erica Trent, a mid-level project manager with zero biomedical training, leading a meeting with my team. She wore the expression of someone reciting instructions she didn't understand, flanked by two fresh-faced hires who probably couldn't spell synaptic inhibition if you spotted them the first 6 letters. "Dr. Hale," she said, clearly surprised to see me, "Blake felt you were being underutilized and thought it best if we reassign day-to-day responsibilities so you can focus on high-level initiatives." Translation: get out of the way, old man. We got cheaper plans. I smiled. Not with my mouth, with that kind of smile you feel behind your eyes when you realize the game has changed and you're still the only one holding a loaded hand. "Of course," I said, happy to support from wherever leadership believes I can add value. They expected a fight, but I had no intention of giving them one. Not yet. Instead, I returned to my now half-empty office and opened a folder labeled License Agreement, US 9762853B1. A highlighted section 12.4, Termination upon departure of inventor from licensed entity. And I waited. I didn't rage. I didn't storm the executive floor or throw a resignation letter in someone's smug, moisturized face. That would have been too easy for them. They wanted that. They were baiting me into making it official, to hand over my severance-free exit with a bow. No, I stayed. Smiled. Nodded. I played the role of the agreeable relic with grace. And while they thought they were burying me under irrelevant tasks, I was quietly unearthing the weapon they never saw coming. Inventory Audit. That was the official title of my new high-value assignment. Combing through 15 years of lab equipment, compiling condition reports, assessing redundancies. The kind of task you hand to an intern with Excel training and too much free time. But I took it. I took it seriously. I worked late, cross-referenced serial numbers, open cabinets no one had touched since the Bush administration. I logged everything. More importantly, I made myself invisible. The less noise I made, the less attention they paid. Blake didn't notice that I was backing up terabytes of research notes to encrypted drives, original trial designs, calibration records, data models, internal memos, all legally my property, all created under terms that specifically excluded company ownership of independent IP not explicitly assigned. I had built a fortress out of documentation, and every day they kept me in the shadows was another brick in the wall. Then came the final straw, the day they shut down Project Orion. That was the therapy I'd been nurturing like a second heart, a neurological delivery system built to treat early-stage ALS, still in preclinical validation, but showing promise none of our existing products had ever achieved. It was bleeding edge, risky, expensive, and transformative. Erica called it a misaligned allocation of R&D focus. Blake called it non-prioritized. I called it what it was, a betrayal of everything Synthera was supposed to stand for. Worse, they dismantled the team. Kavita, my right hand for over a decade, reassigned to spreadsheet review. Alex, one of the brightest postdocs I'd ever mentored, rerouted to manufacturing optimization. And David Chun, gone without warning, poached by a competitor. No goodbye. No handshake. Just gone. I confronted Erica, her voice glazed with the kind of fake empathy you only learn from HR workshops. "Dr. Hale, we value your historical insight, but strategic alignment must be forward-focused." I didn't even flinch, because by then, I knew what came next. They were soft-firing me, cutting off air until I walked out myself. And when I did, I'd take their license with me. The one tied to that sweet, overlooked patent they'd built a billion-dollar empire on. So I called my attorney. James Whitmore wasn't flashy. No Bluetooth headset, no corner office with a view of the bay. But he was the kind of lawyer who spoke softly, read everything twice, and didn't blink when I laid out the situation. "This is remarkable," he said, flipping through the documents. "You realize if they terminate your employment, that license disappears. Legally, they cannot operate their current platform without renegotiation." "I do realize," I said. "I just want to make sure they don't." He leaned back, nodding. "They're going to panic. I'm counting on it." That was the moment the trap finished closing. All I had to do now was wait for them to pull the trigger. 3 days later, the company announced a streamlined innovation plan. That's how they phrased it. They sent an all-hands memo filled with charts and synergies and language so abstract it could have been about pizza delivery or space exploration. You wouldn't know. But buried in paragraph 4, just beneath a quote from Blake about operational velocity, was the news. Dr. Nathan Hale has completed his value cycle with Synthera and will be departing the organization effective immediately. Value cycle. That was how they ended 15 years of blood, sweat, and science. A product life cycle term. Something you use for shampoo, not people. I didn't reply to the email. I didn't pack my things. I waited. Later that day, Blake came to my office, envelope in hand, that winning grin flickering just enough to give away the unease. "This is just business, Nathan," he said. "Evolution." I took the envelope. Didn't open it. "Blake," I said, "before I sign anything, there's something you should know about patent US 9762853B1. That was the moment he blinked, not just his eyes, but his confidence. I watched it crack. "What about it?" "It was never assigned to Synthera. You've been operating under a license that expires today." The color drained from his face. The next 30 seconds were silent, but in that silence, I could hear the future shattering behind his eyes. And I smiled for the first time in months. By the time Blake Donovan closed my office door behind him, I could already feel the tremors beginning to ripple through the steel and glass skeleton of Synthera's headquarters. He had left with his jaw clenched so tightly I thought I heard a molar crack. But I didn't need to see his face to know the damage was done. I knew the terrain we were standing on, and I had just pulled the first pin from a minefield he didn't even know he was walking through. It took exactly 48 hours. 48 hours before the email started. First from Synthera's legal counsel, dry, curt, and phrased with that lawyerly tone that feigns calm while broadcasting panic in every subtextual syllable. "We like to clarify the chain of title related to patent US 9762853B1. Clarify, as if this was a light drizzle in need of an umbrella and not a full-blown legal hurricane." I didn't respond. James, my attorney, did. His reply was a surgical strike, precise, professional, devastating. He attached the filing history, the original license agreement, and highlighted section 12.4 in bold. "Termination upon departure. Effective immediately. No renegotiation clause. No extensions." And that was only the beginning. The next morning, my phone lit up with calls I didn't answer, from Melissa, from Erica, from 3 numbers I didn't recognize, which I assumed were burner phones they'd bought in desperation to get around their own legal walls. I watched the voicemails pile up like desperate Morse code from a ship taking on water. I listened to none of them. Instead, I poured myself a cup of coffee in my new office at Virion Labs, where my name was still etched in fresh brass on the door, and began outlining licensing terms for what was about to become the most expensive rescue package in Synthera's history. By day 5, it got louder. Production at Synthera halted. Regulatory bodies flagged their filings. Their supply partners, the distributors and hospital networks who relied on predictable delivery schedules, began sending notices. Questions turned to suspicion. Suspicion turned to pressure. Analysts on Wall Street started murmuring about unexplained disruptions in core pipeline continuity. In short, the streets smelled blood. The board scrambled. I know this not from any direct report, of course. I wasn't in the room, but from a sudden flurry of activity in the press. Vague PR statements about temporary process issues, clumsy interviews where Martin Kessler looked like he was trying to hold his breath and his credibility at the same time. His usual polish had begun to fray at the edges. He looked less like a confident CEO and more like a man slowly realizing his steering wheel wasn't connected to the wheels anymore. And still, they hadn't reached out to me directly. Until Blake called. He didn't even bother with small talk. Just launched into it, voice tight with frustration and barely restrained desperation. "This is completely unreasonable, Nathan," he said. "You're holding the company hostage." "Interesting choice of words," I replied, leaning back in my chair and staring out at the ocean. "I always thought of it as consequences. You didn't disclose this before your termination. That's a violation of—" "I didn't conceal anything," I cut in. "The documentation was filed properly. It was your job to know what assets were tied to personnel before restructuring. You're going to destroy this company over a technicality." "No," I said, my voice flat. "You're destroying this company with your ignorance. I'm just a footnote." There was a silence on the line. One of those long, dragging silences where you can hear someone realizing they no longer have control of the narrative. "Then, what do you want?" There it was. Not anger, not even bargaining. Just surrender disguised as curiosity. "I don't want anything from Synthera," I told him. "Virion has already expressed interest in exclusive rights. But if Synthera would like to retain non-exclusive access to the platform, the terms are simple. Triple the current market licensing rate, renewed annually at my discretion, and public acknowledgement of my ownership in every regulatory and investor-facing document." "That's extortion. That's business, Blake. You remember, the thing you said wasn't personal." I hung up. 3 days later, Melissa left me 6 voicemails in a row, each one more frantic than the last. "Elena, sorry, Nathan, we need the calibration protocols for the trial batch validation. The files are corrupted and the new team can't replicate your methodology. Please, just an hour of your time. Blake doesn't understand how the blood-brain assay is sequenced, and we're about to miss the next FDA milestone." "Nathan, for God's sake, they're falling apart." I saved every single one, but I didn't call back. I didn't need to, because by then, the panic wasn't just in their voices. It was in the markets, in the partner withdrawals, in the now public revelation that the core of Synthera's product line was running on a license that no longer existed. The trap had snapped shut, and they had walked into it with eyes wide open. It was a Friday morning when the final, inevitable call came. Not from Blake, not from Erica, not even from the legal team drowning in their own footnotes, but from Martin Kessler himself. Synthera's CEO, the man who had once handed me a plaque for transformational scientific impact before promptly slashing my department's budget 6 months later. His voice came through my phone like a ghost from a world I had already left behind. Polished, controlled, trying hard not to sound like a man grasping at the last threads of a suit that no longer fit. "Nathan," he began, after a beat too long. "We seem to have had a misunderstanding." I didn't respond immediately. I let the silence sit between us, let him feel it stretch. "A misunderstanding," I finally repeated casually. "That's an interesting word choice for what looks like a multi-million-dollar operational breakdown, Martin." He cleared his throat. I could hear him pacing, could picture the Bluetooth headset, the corner office blinds drawn shut to block out the protesters or reporters or whoever was gathering on the lawn now, that Synthera's stock was tumbling below the second decimal. "Blake may have overstepped his authority," he said. "The board was not fully informed of the licensing status tied to your intellectual property." "I suppose it's difficult to inform the board when no one reads the fine print," I said, my voice low, calm. "Especially when they're busy pushing out the only person who knew how the system actually worked." "You built something extraordinary here, Nathan," Martin continued, his tone now dipping into something softer, an appeal, or maybe a confession. "It was never our intention to devalue that. The company needs you. We want you back. Full reinstatement, budget control, autonomy, whatever you need." I almost laughed, not because it was funny, but because the symmetry was too perfect. They had discarded me like expired inventory, and now here was the CEO himself, offering me back everything I had already earned like it was a gift. "I appreciate the sentiment," I said, "but I've already moved on. Virion Labs has provided the kind of environment Synthera stopped offering years ago: vision, integrity, and the basic understanding that science can't be run on quarterly spreadsheets." Martin's voice tightened. "Be reasonable, Nathan. This situation is damaging everyone. The FDA is holding our filings. Our supply chain is imploding. Our partners are demanding answers we can't give. The board is willing to renegotiate licensing at a premium, double market rate, plus a seat on the innovation advisory panel. I stood by the window in my new office, looking out over the harbor. My coffee was still warm. My team, most of whom had followed me from Synthera, was 2 doors down, laughing about something as they reviewed protocol adjustments for our new delivery system. The contrast was blinding. Triple market rate, I said, my tone deliberate. Non-exclusive license, renewable annually. At my discretion, and public acknowledgement of my role as the sole inventor of the platform in every investor report and regulatory submission. Martin hesitated. That's unprecedented. So, is building your entire product line on a patent you forgot to own? I replied. You can't produce without it. You can't file. You can't ship. What exactly do you think your negotiating position is, Martin? More silence. When he spoke again, the edge was gone. We'll need to run that by the board. I'm sure you will. But I suggest you do it quickly, because Virion is considering an exclusive license offer. Once that's signed, you'll need to develop a new delivery platform from scratch. You wouldn't do that. Why not? I asked, finally letting the steel creep into my voice. Synthera made it clear this was never personal. Just business. I'm just doing the math. The line went dead. I let the phone rest on my desk and breathed in the quiet. Not the suffocating silence I'd known in my final months at Synthera, but the satisfying, uncluttered calm that comes after you've played every card with precision and patience. After you've refused a break, not out of pride, but principle. It wasn't about revenge anymore. Not really. It was about a system that had taught people like Blake and Martin that creators were disposable. That vision could be replaced by spreadsheets. That innovation was just another line item to be shaved for margins. And now they would pay for that lesson at triple the rate. It didn't happen all at once. That's the thing people misunderstand about collapse. It doesn't come in a single thunderclap or a neatly packaged announcement to shareholders. No, collapse begins like a fever. Quiet, subtle. You notice one little glitch, a regulatory form flag for review, then a distribution delay, then a partner asking too many questions. You dismiss each as a blip, but they build. And by the time you realize the fever has broken the system, the body is already shaking, and there's no antidote left in the drawer. I watched Synthera unravel from a distance, not with bitterness, not even with joy, but with the quiet detachment of a man watching a structure he once helped build implode in slow motion. I knew where the supports had been cut. I knew where the shortcuts had been taken. And now, so did everyone else. First came the manufacturing freeze. The expiration of the patent license triggered an automatic lockout on several key modules within Synthera's smart production framework. The machines, custom calibrated for the nanocarrier sequencing I'd spent years developing, refused to load updated batches. Any attempt to override them triggered error codes. Their entire production line stalled. Replacement wasn't a matter of flipping switches. It meant rewriting core code, rebuilding protocols, and passing new validation all over again. That would take months, maybe a year. Then came the FDA stop orders. Without a valid IP license, Synthera couldn't legally submit trial data tied to my delivery platform. And because they had already filed preclinical results based on it, every submission pending review was now frozen in bureaucratic limbo. Emails from regulators started flooding in. Questions about the legitimacy of proprietary rights, documentation requests, warnings that non-compliance could result in further penalties. Synthera's internal compliance team was overwhelmed, understaffed, and utterly unequipped for this kind of legal firestorm. By the end of week 2, 3 major hospital networks had temporarily suspended their partnership agreements. They couldn't afford the risk. If Synthera's platform was compromised, even in theory, and a competing provider offered a stable, fully compliant alternative, well, that wasn't a gamble anyone in healthcare was going to take. Which brings us to Virion Labs. Our quiet conversations with Meridian Healthcare and the DoD, talks that had once been exploratory, speculative, respectful, suddenly took on a new tone. Now, executives return calls before the second ring. Now, Our white papers were requested on tight timelines. Now, we weren't just a promising alternative. We were the solution Synthera couldn't provide anymore. I remember sitting across from Dr. Sofia Martinez, our chief scientific officer of Virion, as she reviewed the revised proposal for a military contract that had been Synthera's crown jewel since 2019. She looked up from the pages, her eyes calm, voice quiet. "You're sure we can deliver?" "We don't promise what we can't," I said. She nodded once and picked up the phone. That was it. That was the moment the tides shifted. Word got out, slowly at first, then with momentum. Key talent began jumping ship. I received emails from former colleagues at Synthera, some congratulating me, others quietly asking if Virion was hiring. The answer was yes. Our door was open, but only to those who came without bitterness and brought real value. I wasn't building a revenge squad. I was building something better. Back at Synthera, Blake Donovan, the man who had spoken in nothing but frameworks and acronyms, was now silent. Publicly, he retained the title of strategic consultant. Privately, everyone knew he had been sidelined, his access revoked, his calendar cleared. The man who once strutted through the executive floor was now tucked into an open-concept desk near operations, his presence a ghostly reminder of a restructuring strategy that had blown a hole through the hull. Melissa? She pivoted faster than a weather vane in a tornado. One day, she was Blake's lieutenant, delivering his agile innovation plan with robotic precision. The next, she was expressing deep concerns about the rushed dismantling of legacy protocols. She tried to frame herself as a whistleblower, but no one was buying it. The media began circling. Not the major outlets. Not yet, but the biotech trades, the watchdog blogs, the investment analysts who tracked executive shakeups and patent litigation like sport. How did Synthera lose its crown jewel? One headline asked. When cost optimization backfires, read another. Investors took note. The stock dipped, then plunged. And I simply kept showing up at Virion. Each morning, I walked into a lab full of people who understood why we were there. Not to save face, not to salvage market share, but to push the boundaries of what was possible. We weren't operating from desperation. We were operating from purpose. Sometimes I get a voicemail from someone at Synthera, still trying, still begging for access to protocols or context they'd stripped from their systems when they pushed me out. I never deleted them, not out of cruelty, but as reminders, not of what they did to me, but of what they did to themselves. Because in the end, the collapse didn't happen when they fired me. It happened the moment they decided the future could be managed by people who didn't understand the past. I never intended to build another empire. When I left Synthera, I wasn't chasing redemption or empire or even vindication. I was chasing clarity, a quiet place to think, to create, to reclaim the version of myself that used to stare at data until midnight and whisper to molecules like they were secrets only I could unlock. Virion Labs wasn't glamorous, not yet. The walls were a little too beige, the equipment a little too rented. But it was clean. It was honest. And most importantly, it was mined, not by ownership but by purpose. That purpose grew fast. The licensing deal with Synthera finalized on a Tuesday. Triple market rate. Non-exclusive. Annual renewal. Subject to my discretion. Their CEO signed with a grimace, and somewhere in the middle of his legal team's signature block was a quiet clause they hated even acknowledging. Public acknowledgement of my authorship and ownership on every major filing. Every time Synthera moved forward, my name moved with them. But what followed was more powerful than legal leverage. What followed was people. It started with an email from Dr. Kavita Sharma. No preamble. Just, I heard what happened. If there's room, I'd like to come work with you again. I miss building things that matter. There was always room for Kavita. She'd been my right hand for over a decade, and I didn't trust many people with unsupervised cell cultures, but I trusted her with my name, my data, my life's work. Within a week, she was sitting across from me in the Virion cafeteria, sipping mint tea and looking more alive than she had in years. It feels like breathing again, she said softly. Like I'm not just surviving in a meeting culture. Others followed. Alex, the postdoc turned systems genius they'd buried in manufacturing, showed up with a duffel bag and a portfolio of optimizations no one at Synthera had understood. Maria, who they dumped into admin review, came next, and she brought protocols they hadn't even backed up before erasing her badge access. David Chun took longer. We reached out. It wasn't a job inquiry. It was an invitation to coffee. We met in a quiet cafe by the harbor, and for a while, we didn't talk about work. Just books, dogs, coffee roasting. Eventually, the conversation circled around, as they always do, to legacy. I took a job at Genova Tech, he said. It's fine, but it's not real. Not like what we built. They're safe, strategic, sterile. I didn't leave Synthera to join another Synthera in disguise. You're not looking for a job, I said. He smiled. No, I'm looking for a mission. He joined 2 weeks later, Director of Translational Research. Day 1, he overhauled the preclinical trial roadmap and shaved 3 months off our timeline without cutting a single quality check. And suddenly, what had started as a quiet outpost became something else. We weren't just a lab. We were a home for the exiled. Not the defeated, but the discarded builders, the people who once dared to dream in an industry increasingly dominated by MBAs with AI-generated roadmaps. People who remembered what it meant to invent rather than optimize. And the industry noticed. Meridian Healthcare, which had paused contracts with Synthera, reactivated their partnership with us. The DoD, once skeptical of experimental delivery platforms, awarded us a new research grant based on our previous track record and demonstrated control over core IP. The punchline? They cited Synthera's instability as a risk factor. Somewhere, Blake Donovan must have choked on his kale smoothie. The more we delivered, the more Synthera unraveled. Not out of spite, but because the scaffolding they'd leaned on for so long was now standing somewhere else, under a different name, powered by the very minds they had deemed excess. And in my office, quiet, sunlit, scattered with blueprints and old lab notes, I kept a framed note on the shelf, a photo of the original patent filing with a sticky tab that read, just in case they forget. Not out of ego, not as a trophy, but as a reminder that the value of an idea isn't just in how it scales. It's in who believes in it enough to stay when the numbers look bad, the trials fail, and the suits start whispering about value cycles. I wasn't building a company. I was rebuilding the soul of the work. And this time, I wasn't doing it alone. It's strange how quiet victory can be. I always imagined it would come with trumpets, headlines, vindication, applause echoing through shareholder meetings. But the truth is, when the dust settles, real victories don't roar. They hum, low and steady, like the engine of something built right. Something built to last. Synthera never collapsed in a single moment. It wasn't an explosion, it was erosion. A slow, stubborn decay from the inside out. Their name still sits on a building. Their logo still flies at biotech conferences, but inside, the scaffolding has shifted. The people who gave that name meaning, most of them are gone. The ideas they celebrated, licensed, leased, outsourced. Their heartbeat, borrowed. And the most ironic part, they still use my technology. Every dose they produce, every therapy they advertise, every investor pitch that name drops revolutionary drug delivery. They're drawing life from a system I designed, a system they once tried to delete from their future in the name of optimization. Except now they pay for it. Triple the market rate. Public credit. Annual renewal. Subject to one person's discretion. Mine. But this story was never about revenge. It was about value, the kind you can't log in spreadsheets or squeeze into a quarterly update. The kind that doesn't show up on balance sheets until it's gone. I didn't destroy Synthera. They hollowed themselves out the moment. They believed a CFO understood the future of medicine better than the scientists who built it. What they forgot, what so many companies forget, is that innovation isn't a switch you can flip on demand. It's not a department. It's not a line item. It's a culture, a belief, a decision made over and over again to prioritize curiosity over caution, principle over politics, integrity over convenience. You can't manufacture that in a PowerPoint. You earn it with long nights, failed trials, sleepless obsession, and a team that believes in something bigger than their job description. That's what we built at Virion Labs. Not just a better lab, not just a leaner, smarter company, but a place where science still mattered, where researchers weren't seen as costs, but as catalysts, where failure wasn't punished, but understood as the foundation of every great leap forward. I walk through our lab now, and I see Kavita leading a team through a new neurodelivery model that's showing early promise for treating PTSD in combat veterans. I see David Chin laughing at his own whiteboard sketch, covered in red scribbles and bad jokes, just like he used to do when no one was watching. I see new hires, kids fresh out of Berkeley, Stanford, Rice, wide-eyed and fearless because no one's taught them yet to be afraid of being bold. And sometimes I just sit at my desk with a view of the harbor and I think about the long arc of this story. The old office, the coffee machine, the patent I almost forgot I owned. And I remind myself it wasn't luck. It was patience. It was conviction. It was choosing every single time to keep building even when they tried to take the blueprint away. People ask me now what the moral of the story is. What I learned. What I'd say to the next Nathan Hale, sitting in a closet lab, chasing something no one else sees. This is what I'd say. Never let people who measure worth in margins define the value of what you create. If they don't understand your work, they'll try to own it. If they can't control your mind, they'll try to erase your name. But if you stay the course, if you build from integrity, not ego, your time will come. And when it does, you won't have to shout. They'll come knocking, and you'll answer with terms you define. And that is what true leverage looks like. I pour myself a cup of Ethiopian roast. Same beans, different office. Only this time, it tastes better, not because it's sweeter, but because I finally know what it means to be valued for exactly who you are. If you've ever been underestimated, pushed aside, or told you're past your value cycle, let this story remind you, you are not disposable. Real innovation doesn't come from spreadsheets. It comes from people with vision, grit, and the courage to stand their ground. What would you have done in Nathan's shoes? Drop your thoughts in the comments. We read everyone. Share this story with someone who's been quietly building something powerful, waiting for their moment. And if you believe integrity and expertise still matter in a world obsessed with shortcuts, subscribe for more stories of justice, strategy, and smart, satisfying revenge. This wasn't just a story about business. It was a story about worth.